Okay, so good evening to all of you all. So welcome to the fourth Let's Talk session for the year. So to give a background about what Let's Talk is, so Let's Talk is a series of sessions organized by the IEEE Young Professionals Sri Lanka to educate young professionals on timely matters and on non-technical skills that are required to shape up their careers. So today, the topic for today is demystifying pricing, a practical guide on how to price your product or service. So the session is conducted today by Mr. Aloka Gunasekara. Uh, Mr. Aloka Gunasekara is a program manager of Startup X Foundry. In his role, he helps tech entrepreneurs to breach global markets and work towards creating a conducive startup ecosystem in Sri Lanka. He also co-founded Social Seed Media Private Limited in 2011, and since then he has been part of a new founding team of several cutting-edge tech companies. He has also been part of several tech-related volunteer efforts, such as Refresh Colombo, Startup Weekend, and is currently the co-director of Startup Grind in Sri Lanka. So before I hand it over to Aloka, just to remind a few pointers. So we'll be sharing the Slido link and the link to the presentation chat section. So you guys, every one of y'all attending today can send in your questions while Mr. Aloka conducts the session through Slido. Or he also recommends that if there's a particular slide that you want to raise a question at, you could always comment it on the slide as well. So everyone who has access to the link has comment privileges as well. So without further ado, Aloka, I'll leave it over to you.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Mithu. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, IEEE Young Professionals Sri Lanka, for inviting me to conduct this session. I remember Mithushan and I had a few chats about how to do pricing, even some time back when he was an intern, and we got to meet often at Startup X Foundry. Now, let me share my screen. Screen. Right. I hope you can see my screen. All right. So now, before I get into the topic, I think it's important for the audience to understand why pricing is such an important topic for startups, SMEs, and in general, anyone who gets paid for whatever that they do. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about a few different things. One, I'm going to talk about why pricing is such a massive problem. I'm going to bring in a couple of examples of even larger companies who haven't gotten their pricing right. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the academic with pricing is, oh, am I still connected? Wait. Okay. I hope you guys can hear me. So one of the biggest problems about pricing is it's really difficult to get it right. So the problem about pricing is you are always in doubt whether the pricing is too low or too high. And one of the biggest problems that we see in Sri Lanka is most businesses don't get many customers to try different versions of pricing. Now, let me elaborate on this a little. Now, what happens in Sri Lanka is because Sri Lanka is such a small country, we only have about 21 million people living in it. And most of the products or services that we come up with will only ever have about maximum of about 100,000 people using them. The exceptions would be things like Helakuru or Picme, or companies like Unilever or Hemas, who actually have like massive service offerings, and people are using them just because of how important these products are. But many of the SMEs or startups or entrepreneurs don't necessarily have that luxury of having like such a large audience to try out different versions of pricing. Now, there's another side to it. So it's difficult for startups or SMEs to begin with, but it's doubly more so difficult if you are a consultant or a freelancer. So now there's a um, different angle to it. For example, it's ideal if you can keep increasing the price that you charge for whatever the services that you do, that you provide, especially if you're a consultant or freelancer, on an annual basis. Say if possible at least like 5%. But the problem is if you don't have a baseline to understand whether that price is okay, it's going to be a little bit of a problem. Now, when it comes to early stage startups, SMEs, or even early stage consultants or freelancers, one of the biggest problems is when you don't have customers, you think that you have priced it too high. When you do have customers, you think that you have priced it a little lower. So you think that, okay, I should have priced it a little higher. So there are so many angles to it. It's a lot to do with the psychology of you as a person whenever pricing is considered. So now getting this pricing is a problem for smaller players, but it's even a problem for larger players. So this is actually from May 7th of 2020. So README ran an article about how pricing is inconsistent across multiple different broadband service providers. So if you look at it, so SLT has gotten it really, really wrong. So I guess the cheapest way to get better internet or better prices to maybe get multiple 36 GB packages at 41 rupees. So if you get, let's say, 170 GB at 52 rupees, you're losing a lot. So if you can figure out a way to get multiple 36 packages, might as well go ahead because you are going to save a lot of money. So SLT is pretty bad when it comes to their pricing strategy. This is Mobitel. Mobitel is kind of okay, but still it's not that great. The best pricing strategy that out of Mobitel, SLT, and Dialog is actually Dialog. So the pricing starts at a very high price. So if you use 15 GB per month, that's going to cost you about 60 rupees. But if you're using, let's say, 90 GB a month, it's going to be something like 43 rupees. And if it's 160 GB, the price is even lower, but it's negligible. So if imagine that I am a heavy user, I wouldn't necessarily mind going back and forth between these different packages. And if you are Dialog, what you would be seeing is that, okay, most people who are using these larger packages are the most loyal customers. And these packages must be comprising a large majority of the top line that Dialog has. So they have priced it accordingly in a way that makes sense for people to use it. So the heavy users are compensated for using those heavy packages. And usually these are postpaid packages. So anyone who's using, let's say, a prepaid package at 15 GB a month, they are paying a massive price. But importantly for Dialog, the people who are paying this massive premium are also comprising the bottom of the pyramid for the Dialog broadband usage. So essentially what happens is you will have a massive number of people who are paying more money for the privilege of using the broadband services. And this is the sort of pricing strategy that I would have done if I am given a product like this. Now, moving on. So how am I qualified to talk about pricing? Now, this is kind of important for you to understand why I'm talking about it. So I've been a product manager for about 9 different products over 10 years. That's before I joined Startup X Foundry. And I've sold products to mainly US, UK, Australian, Sri Lankan, and Singaporean clients. But I've worked with a cross-section of about customers from about 30 different countries. Right now, I help startups, SMEs with their pricing strategies on an ongoing basis. Even during the COVID period, I actually did a consultation with about 40 different SMEs in the Uva province, and one of the biggest things that I help them out with is how to do their pricing properly. And the fourth one is probably the most important. I have burned my fingers enough times with pricing. I think I've done that more times than I can remember. So essentially, what I would like you to do is like learn from my mistakes and don't make the same mistakes when you do the pricing. Now, what are the common issues with pricing? Though we've talked about a cross section of some of the issues. To me, the next items are going to be other issues that I've faced on a very regular basis. So uh, one of the biggest things is I don't understand how to do pricing. This is especially true if you're a newbie, or if you're a new startup, or if you're a new SME, or you're a new consultant or freelancer. And there's very little information about it. I mean, yes, there's a lot of academic writing about it, but when you actually go to do it on a practical way, realities are very different. Um, the second question is, are willing to pay my price? So imagine that you put your price, let's say at 3,000 rupees per hour of your value. So you're not too sure whether people are willing to pay that. And then the next question attached to that is, who are my customers? So why this is such an important question is, you come up with a product or service offering, then you attach a price to it, and then you think that, okay, my customers are going to pay me this particular amount of money. But then you go and do the business development, and then you find that, okay, the price might not necessarily be something that willing to pay. So then you have to either adjust your price or either adjust who your customer is. So it's a very, very tricky thing to do. Like, you need to be very, very aware of like where the problem is, whether it's the pricing or whether it's that, okay, you are targeting the wrong customers. So this is, should I price in US dollars, is very relevant to Sri Lanka for multiple reasons. Now, one of the biggest reasons is the inflation. Right now, the documented inflation rate is something like 4%, 4.6% if I'm not mistaken. But the real value of the Sri Lankan rupee is fluctuating quite heavily. So imagine that you price your product or service at the beginning of 2020. The real value of money that you are going to get for that product or a service offering is going to be very different from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So you are not going to get the same utility that you are getting at the beginning to the end of the year. So one of the easiest way to overcome this is to price your product or service in US dollars. To put things in perspective, there are some services that I provide since from 2007 or so, and my price haven't changed yet because I'm pricing in dollars. So I'm cushioned out of all the inflation and all the rest of the issues that come with it, just because I price in dollars. Now, here's another common question: is tax part of my price? Usually not. Tax is something extra to whatever that you charge your customers, but because that Sri Lankan tax structure changes almost on a quarterly basis, being aware of what happens with the taxation is going to be very important. I'll give you an example. So back in the day, we we were actually working with one of the government institutes, and then the Indian Revenue Department came in and said, hey, look, okay, you guys have to charge NBT at 2%, even if you're a new company. We were a new company at that point. And we actually got some clarification from the Indian Revenue Department. We actually got a document from them stating that we as a new company can charge NBT. And then we took that letter to our government customer and submitted the letter, and they said, yeah, okay, fine, we'll pay you the 2% NBT on top of the quoted price. which they did. And then we took that 2% back to inland revenue. And then inland revenue said that, sorry guys, we made a mistake. Now we can't accept this 2%. Now the 2% was something like 50,000 rupees, not too much, but the problem is it created such a massive administrative issue for our government customer as well as for us. We were almost blacklisted just because of that issue. So, I mean, there's no way to go around these things. You definitely have to face them and figure out like how to go about it. Thankfully, we managed to somehow sort this out. But when you do pricing, these are things that you will have to be aware of as well. And then I guess this is one of the most common problems. This is especially true when you have, say, customers buying your product or service, and then they are not using it. So then all of a sudden you are thinking, okay, so people are buying it, but people are not using it. So I don't have enough daily logins, so I don't have enough daily active users. So what gives? So that's a bit of a problem. So then you are doubting yourself, okay, did I price it too low so that people can afford to buy it and then not use it? So then there are so many other issues with that. So now that we've talked about the common issues, let me go about, explaining why or how pricing things can be done in an academic way. Now, please bear with me. I know that this is some boring stuff. So essentially the definition for pricing strategy is this. It's a model or a method to establish the best price for a product or service, yada, yada, yada. But the reality is very, very different from the definition. Because the reality is when you are doing the pricing, you are actually dealing with tangible things, things that you have paid for, or things that you have to pay for. For example, there could be capital expenses like the computers that you have bought, or there could be operational expenses like the rents that you have to pay, or the salaries that you have to pay, and so many other things, EPF, ETF, electricity bills, internet bills, water bills, then whatever that you have to pay for your lawyers as a company secretary, or whatever that you have to pay for your auditors, accountants, so on and so forth. So when you are dealing with all these expenses, it's actually very difficult to navigate through the pricing angle. So it's really important that you document everything in terms of what your costs are. And then you really need to have a clear head, and if possible, like bring together a few people and figure out like how the pricing strategy is going to be. Because unfortunately, this is true for Sri Lanka. That is, when you set up a pricing strategy, it's very, very difficult for you to go back and change it. So you have to be very careful with it. So the academic way of going about things, the definition and all that is nice to have, but it doesn't mean that, okay, you are going to be able to come up with a pricing strategy just by looking at definitions. Having said that, there's an important idea that all of you have to understand, and that is the price elasticity of demand. Now, what the hell does it even mean? So essentially what it means is when you divide the percentage change in quantity by the percentage change in price, you get price elasticity of demand. Now, what exactly does this mean? So price elasticity of demand is used to determine how a change in price affects consumer demand. So so I will actually explain what this is in a later slide, but Let me take an example. So I'm sure you guys know of like, iPhones and how stupidly expensive they are. But the fact of the matter is, people still buy iPhones just because of the prestige factor and just because it's a status symbol. So every every consequent iPhone model that you're getting is it's actually a little expensive than than its predecessor, but people are still buying it. So what happens then is the demand is still there despite the price being increased. So essentially what happens is the demand is inelastic for the iPhone. So the same is applicable for alcohol in Sri Lanka. I mean, you can have the government increasing the price of alcohol, but our people still go and buy alcohol anyway. On the other hand, elastic products suffer from pricing fluctuations, and examples for this could be like vehicles to movie tickets. Right now, no movie tickets are being sold just because of COVID. Vehicles are a little different, like depending on the time of the year. Demand for vehicles could also differ. Like if it's nearer to a budget, then obviously the demand would go down. If it's after the budget, obviously the demand would be higher, so on and so forth. So moving on again. Okay, so I'm going. I'm talking about this price elasticity of demand because it's such an important thing. Um, so the concept of price elasticity helps you to understand if your product or service is sensitive to price fluctuations. Um, Ideally, you want your products your product demand to be elastic, so the demand remains stable even if the price do fluctuate. But in real life, things are a little different. So prices for products and services are rarely inelastic. It's usually very, very elastic. So unless you run some sort of a monopoly or oligopoly, or if you have a price control in place, it's very, very difficult to have inelastic pricing for the products and services that you provide, especially in a country like Sri Lanka. Now, moving on, still I'm sticking with the academic stuff, but I promise you that okay, this is going to be probably the only academic sort of slide that I have. Now, in terms of pricing strategies, I looked at multiple different variations, and the pricing strategies that I've showcased here are actually from HubSpot. And I'm sure there are some pricing strategies which are self-explanatory, and there are some pricing strategies which are not self-explanatory. Now, let me highlight a few of these not so self-explanatory ones. For example, let me take the high-low pricing strategy, that is number 5. So high-low pricing strategy is when a company initially sells a product at a high price but lowers the price when the product drops in novelty or relevance. The best example I can give you is the demand for OnePlus phones. So OnePlus has this thing where they release a new phone every 6 months. So what happens is the previous phone obviously loses its value, not because it's a bad phone, but it's just that you have a newer phone, so they need to get rid of the stocks. So this is also why you see discount sales, clearance sections, and year-end sales. All these are examples of high-low pricing in action. Then let me take another example of these not so self-explanatory pricing strategies, and that is bundle pricing. Bundle pricing is number 12. Now, the best example I can give you about bundle pricing is the TV channels that you get with dialog TV or POTV. So these are usually bundled together. So what happens is, whether you like it or not, you are getting some channels that you are not going to watch, or you're forced to watch with your parents or with your grandparents, so on and so forth. So now moving on, and this is probably the important perspective that I'm going to bring to this whole presentation, and that is knowing your worth. So this is really important for pretty much everyone who's listening in to this presentation. Now, if I ask you the question, what is the price of one of your hours? How many of you would be able to answer that question right now? I'm sure a majority of you would not be able to answer this question right away. I know I wasn't when somebody asked me this question. So there's no right or wrong way to do this, but let me tell you like what I am doing to understand the price of one of my hours. Now, so what I usually do is I take my average earnings for a month and divide it by 160. So 160 stands for 160 hours. That is 40 hours a week multiplied by 4 weeks per month. So this is just a rough calculation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a super accurate answer. So essentially what I do is I take my earnings, reiterating again, I take my earnings divided by 160 and then I get a number. So I stick with that number just for calculation purposes. Now imagine my hourly earning is calculated this way, and that's about 5,000 rupees. So for a lack of a better example, that means that if I sleep for 8 hours, the monetary cost of that is 40,000 rupees. Now, honestly, I wouldn't compromise my sleep at any cost. I mean, my sleep is my sleep. I really like it. And I don't even dream of suggesting something stupid like this to you either. But the idea here is that, okay, you need to know what your hourly value is. Now, understanding this is really important, especially for your life also. For example, I use this value to determine whether I'm going to take a cab or whether I'm going to drive. If I have some work to do on the way, I usually take a cab because then, I can save some time on that. I use this method to even decide how best to allocate my time, even with the work stuff that I have. So the logic here is that how I choose to spend my working time has to gain me a value of 5,000 rupees or more. So what I suggest is, understanding your value for one of your hours and using that in real life is really important when you want to do pricing. I'll tell you how it connects to the rest of the pricing that you will do for your startup or SME or even your consultation or your freelance work. Now, one of the biggest problems that I've come across is, this is especially true for solo entrepreneurs, is that most entrepreneurs don't price their time. So they're like, okay, so I'm getting X amount of profit and that's what I get for spending my time on this particular thing. Well, at a certain point, it's okay to think like that. But you quickly realize that, okay, when you don't allocate a price for your time, things become very, very difficult, very, very fast. And it's going to be very difficult for you to change the course of this pricing thing because of the challenges that I told you about. Now, when businesses grow, outside factors change, then the circumstances change, requirements change, and in fact, like, change is the only concern that you are going to face. So when that's the case, when you leave production factors like time out of pricing equations, you tend to make mistakes that can bite you really badly in the future. And one of the most important things regarding this pricing angle is, okay, knowing your worth allows you to be very, very disciplined. So when you don't do the pricing for your time, what happens is, it's usually the profit that suffers. Among other things, this usually leads to a common complaint that the business is not profitable. Remember that, okay, this is usually not the problem of the business. It's just that the entrepreneur or the startup decided to look at things a little differently, and then they are now complaining that the business is not profitable. Please don't be that person. Know your worth and allocate a price for that. This is really, really important. So what else do I have to price? Do I need to have a price? Okay, so there are two elements to it. You need to understand what the cost of product sold is. That is COGS, COGS. So at the and then there's another side to it. So with COGS, what happens is you look at the production costs, you look at inventory acquisition expenses, labor and raw materials, and indirect costs like marketing and distribution are not included in the COGS. The second one is understand what your customer acquisition cost is. So essentially, this is cost of sales plus cost of marketing divided by new customer acquired. So you get a number. So in Sri Lanka, especially if you do like app development, cost of acquisition is something like 500 to 700 rupees per user. So the number is actually quite high when it comes to apps. So you have to be mindful about such things. Now, at the initial stages, I think most of you guys are still getting into startups or SMEs or starting your careers, so on and so forth. So at the initial stages, with people like you, this COGS and CSC, cost of acquisition, can be assumptions or guesstimates. One advice on the safe side, so this is especially true when you are guesstimating. When you guesstimate, always at 10% more than what your gut feeling says. The worst that can happen is your cost estimate would be higher. But the important aspect of that is you would know what you're dealing with. Don't try to put smaller numbers to make things attractive. Always be honest with yourself on price estimates. Because what happens is if you don't be honest with your price estimates, again, the numbers that you are going to come up with are going to be a little askew. So things are going to be a little dicey when you move forward. Now, here's something very important to remember. So your total cost is a function of cost of product sold and customer acquisition cost. Now, your price for the product or the service will be based on that. Now, this is really important. So when you understand your COGS, cost of goods sold, and customer acquisition cost, essentially what happens is you look at all the different elements. Like now at this point, you have calculated your rents, you have calculated your salaries, all the other overheads and expenses, so on and so forth. And you have an understanding of like what the production or the service that you provide is going to cost you. And then the price that you charge from your customers is going to be based on that. Now, at this point, what I usually do is I build a margin on top of the cost. Depending on the product or the service, this margin for me usually is something between 20 to 60%. However, there were certain instances that I've built something like 200% margins on the services that I provided through the companies that I had. There were like exceptional reasons why I could do the 200% margins, so on and so forth. And one of the biggest reasons was that there were no other people providing the sort of services that we provided at that particular point. So essentially, we were the only people, and that allowed us to charge the higher margins that we charged them. And clients obviously had to work with us because due to like multiple reasons, we were the only people who had the capacity to work in Sri Lanka. So it's a little capitalistic way of going about things, but then again, you're running a business, you're not running a charity. So now, after talking about all these different things, let me re-look at the first table that I shared with you guys. That is the pricing strategies. So now you see there are certain pricing strategies that I have highlighted in green. So in my experience, the ones highlighted in green are the pricing strategies that I used quite often. So competition-based pricing is something that I used in the early stages. Basically, I looked at what the competition charges from their from their clients, and then I tried to price accordingly. I mean, it's good way to start, but you quickly realize that the circumstances are very different. I'll give an example. So imagine that you have a 10-man company, and then your competitor is a 100-man company, and you are pitching for the same client. So your price is $20 per man hour, and your competitor's price is $22 per man hour. But just because that your competitor is a larger company with 100 people, your client is going to tend to think that, okay, that's a better company even at a $2 markup. So these are things that you actually learn from your experience. So I did this competition-based pricing is something that I did, but I quickly realized that, okay, that's not the way to go forward. Cost plus pricing is something that I do even right now. That is, I calculate the cost and then I put a margin on top of that, then I sell it. Hourly pricing, again, self-explanatory. If you are a consultant or a freelancer, this is where you would do your costing, or the pricing would be most probably be based on hourly pricing. So the project-based pricing is again applicable for consultants and freelancers. So instead of you charging your customers on an hourly basis, you charge them on a project basis. And so if you're doing, let's say, SEO or content writing or things like that, usually it's going to be on project based. Value-based pricing is something that I recommend for product-based companies. So essentially, you need to have an understanding of what your costs are. And then, of course, you need to understand what's the sort of value that you bring to the table for your customers. So the pricing has to reflect the value that you bring. For example, imagine that you help your customers to capture a lot of information about a particular process, let's say a logistics process. And the alternative that the customer had been using so far is pen and paper. And you have like 20 people getting involved in that process. And with your system, now you can like bring the number of people who are involved in that process to just 2 people. When that's the case, you actually have to understand the value that you bring to the table and then price your product accordingly. Freemium pricing is highlighted in red just because that I am not a strong believer in freemium pricing. The problem with freemium pricing to me, and this is something that happened to me also, is that you have to do the sale twice. First, you have to bring someone in to use your product or service free, and then you have to convince them again to pay you some amount of money to use the paid version of it. This is actually quite difficult. So you can actually bring people to use the free service, but getting people to convert from free to the paid version is actually very difficult. Unless you have like large amounts of users using your service. For example, if you're a company like Slack, or if you're a company like Atlassian with the Jira and Confluence, freemium pricing is really, really problematic. I have found this to be even massively problematic in markets like Sri Lanka and Australia, where the population is quite small and the number of people who are using your product is actually quite low also. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. And you must have seen that so the presentation that I shared actually has an annexure going on. So in that annexure, I have basically put all the different pricing models, all the 14 different pricing models, and then you can actually figure out how you want to use this. Then, yeah, with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and would like to open the floor for any questions and answers. Oh, before that, um, so feel free to add any comments on the presentation that I shared with you, because then I will obviously get a notification on that, and then I will be able to answer any of the questions that you have, even after, let's say, 3 months or 4 months, or even after a year. So if there's any way that I can help you with, I would definitely like to do that for you guys. So yeah, thanks guys. Any questions that you have, I'm willing to answer.
Uh, okay, thank you, Aloka, for this session. So we do have like a few questions on our end as well.
Okay.
So I'll start off asking the first question. I'll be moderating the questions as well. So anyone who is interested in who is live, you could visit the Slido link and post your questions there, and I will ask it on your behalf. Or if you have any questions, you could always put it on the chat section as well. So there is one question that came through, which I think might be helpful for everyone. Uh, so the question goes as, when considering project-based pricing, how would you price a web or mobile development project? What things would you consider while pricing it?
Hmm. Okay, good question. This is something that I do on a regular basis. So multiple things. One of the so when it comes to web or mobile projects, one of the biggest cost components is the labor cost. So first of all, you need to have some sort of price list on the people who are going to be involved. So for example, if you have, let's say, a software architect, that's a different cost. You can have someone senior, then that's a different cost. Then you can have someone junior or even an intern. So all these different um, experts will have different levels of pricing. Then what you do is you do a bit of an estimate, like, okay, how much or how many hours are going to be used for doing each of these components. So once you do that, the price of is going to be a derivative of whatever the estimates and the prices that you have come up with. Now, how you actually do the hourly rate is dependent on multiple things. Now, uh, some of the some of the guys who are actually in this session today might not have an office, so they could be working from home. When that's the case, you obviously can offer a cheaper price or a lower price. And especially imagine that, okay, you are just trying to set yourselves up, that you are trying to create a portfolio, then you want to have a couple of clients. Ideal case, there's nothing to lose at that point. So you might as well price it a little lower so that you can encourage the customer to work with you. And then once you have enough of a portfolio, then you can slowly build up your pricing. This is the beauty of project-based pricing, because chances are that you might not actually work with the same client twice. When that's the case, do a project, bump up your price a little bit, and then move forward. Yeah. Did I answer that question?
I guess you covered most aspects of it. But actually, there's another follow-up to that as well. There's another question saying, how do you actually consider charging your client on retainer basis?
Okay. So retainers are a bit tricky. First of all, I mean, you need to convince your client quite a lot to come to a retainer. And then the problem with retainers is that, okay, there's so much of back and forth because you can say there are multiple ways of doing retainers, but the most common retainer is based on time. Say, for example, you say that, okay, look, I'm going to do 10 hours of work for you a month at, let's say, 25,000 rupees. So your hourly cost is 2,500 rupees. If the client doesn't use the 10 hours, okay, Bob's your uncle, you can go home with the 25,000. But if the client actually makes use of the 10 hours, then depending on how you priced it, it could be profitable or not. Okay, and then there can be instances where the client might insist that, okay, you do a certain amount of work or certain piece of work within the retainer time period, and that piece of work can be um, much larger than the 10-hour retainer that you have. So my suggestion and my personal experience is that, okay, I don't usually work with customers on retainer basis unless I know the customer really well. So I usually don't go with retainers with first-time customers because things can get messy very soon.
Okay. So just following up on everything that you said so far. So you did give an example in terms of how you could price a product, but if you could add more elements, so we just spoke about mobile and web, but if there anything else that you would like to add to it, can you address that? And also, the biggest issue that happens is we get a lot of change requests
Yeah,
when doing a lot of projects. So the project life cycle or the product life cycle just changes midway. How
yeah.
can you tackle that in terms of pricing?
Okay. So this is not necessarily to do with pricing, but it's something to do with the project management and product management angles. Um, so what I suggest is it's when you're doing a project, it's always better to document everything and then sign everything off with the client. Ideal case, you basically tell the client, okay, these are the components and these are the things that we are going to do, and these are the technologies that we are going to use, and this is how things would look like. So at that point, ideal case, you would need to have some sort of wireframe documentation, um, at least those two when you meet the client, and then explain, okay, this is what it is. Explain to them this is how things are going to be, and then get a clear sign off. And at that point, the client has agreed that, okay, look, this is what it's going to be. There could be change requests that you can actually accommodate within whatever that you do within the project scope. If that's the case, again, document it. That tell the customer that, hey, look, okay, we are going to accommodate these change requests within the scope of the project, just because these are small. But if anything bigger comes about, you need to communicate to the client and say, look, this is beyond the project scope that we discussed. So if you are in good terms with the client, just tell them, hey, look, okay, this is beyond the project scope, and this might actually cost X amount of money. And then have a discussion on that. Don't ever go ahead and do the change requests without getting the prior approval from the customer. And also, like, when you do things like this, always limit your communication to emails, so that everybody's in the clear, and then you have a paper trail regarding whatever that you discussed. Sometimes, so things have happened. So some of the change requests we've gotten came through WhatsApp. So what we usually do is we take it as a screenshot and then send an email saying, hey, look, okay, thank you very much for sending this over. This is our suggestion to go forward. And sometimes we also even send like a quotation. So it's going to be one source of truth. So everything is documented in one platform. So you are not going to deviate across, WhatsApp to Slack to emails to Facebook Messenger to SMS, whatever. That's just a mess. Don't do that. If ever something comes up, always stick to one medium.
Okay. So before we move into our set of questions, we do have one question coming from the audience itself.
Okay.
So the question goes as, what is your advice when pricing a product uh, with short-term business goals?
Right. I would like to have a little bit of a clarification about this short-term business goals.
I think he's talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, whoever asked the question, but I'm assuming he's talking about what if it's like a one-time project, and basically you finish it in like a week or less. How would you price that?
So, so I see two angles to it. So it could be, product development for a customer, or product development on your own, and then you try to figure out like how to price this particular product. Um, if it's product development for a customer, if it's short term, again, okay, so the same principles applies. You just figure out what the number of hours are going to be, and then the inputs that you're going to put into it, and then you put a um, margin on top of that, and then you price it. Simple as that. But if it's a product, then things get a little bit trickier. So then you have to, before you even start working on it, you have to do a pricing on your own. You have just to figure out like what the amount of money and the effort that you're going to put into it. And then you have to do again a guesstimate, thinking that okay, I will have, let's say, 1,000 customers for this particular product or app or whatever, and then you have to understand the cost of acquisition for the 1,000 customers, and then you have to like come up with a pricing for that particular product or the application that you do. Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, I think we actually had a conversation on this before as well. So the next question, I think, just since the advice you gave me was really helpful, I think I'm going to post this to you again. So if I'm a freelancer consultant, like how do I price for my service?
Okay, so there's no right answer to it, Mitu. So one of the biggest things that you will have to understand when you are a freelancer or a consultant is, um, first of all, I identify how rare your skill set is. For example, let me stick with say technology developers or like software developers. So it's very easy to find software developers who know how to do development, like JavaScript to I don't know, .NET to whatever. But it's very difficult to find people who know that, um, and let's say AWS management. So essentially, full stack developers. So people who know a particular tech stack, you can find them. Full stack developers are a little harder. Then it's even harder to find full stack developers who understand principles of product development. So likewise, you have to identify like where you at what segment that you come to, and then when the skill set that you have gets to be rarer, then obviously the amount of money that you can charge is going to be higher. And also there are other factors, like for example, the number of years that you have spent. This is quite stupid when it comes to tech development, because the number of years is never going to be a good indication of how good a developer is. But chances are that, okay, if you have spent enough number of years, then you would have come across enough issues that you have dealt with. So when that's the case, it's really easy for you to like increase your price depending on the number of hours, that the number of years that you have spent on doing something. Then of course there's another side to it, like the um, what do you call it? I'm looking for words here. Give me a second. Yeah, the certifications that you have gotten. For example, there are certain certifications which are very hard to get, and some of them are could be freely available, but most people don't necessarily go to take them. So when these things are considered, like many different things, for example, how good you are as a developer, how good you are as a product manager, or how good you are as a problem solver, or how good you are in terms of getting the correct certifications. All these things contribute to how you value your time. So you will also have to do a little bit of what do you call it, competitor analysis. And then this is where you, I mean, if you're a developer, this is why you would go to, let's say, Stack Overflow or LinkedIn and figure out like who are the people who have the same sort of skill sets that you have. If you don't have that many people with the same skill set, chances are that, okay, you would be able to charge more. But at the same time, keep in mind that, okay, you are going to, the more specialized you are, the more niche a market that you go to. But at the same time, you can charge a little bit more for whatever that you have. Okay, what else?
Okay, so it'll be the last question for you today, since we are also at the end of the session. So it's actually a follow-up to what you said now. So I base my pricing based on my expertise and all my experiences. But just assume that I'm actually bidding against a project and someone actually outbids me, or maybe my service is like priced less than my competitor. How can I salvage that situation?
Can you repeat that question?
Okay, so what I asked is following up on what you said before about pricing a service. So under I bid to a project, assume I do bid to a project, and I
Okay.
price it less than my competitors. So
Okay.
how do you think can I salvage that situation?
All right. Okay. So if you so this actually something that happened to us multiple times. So if you priced it lower, that means you basically laid the cards on the table. So if that happens, well, nothing you can do. You can probably I hope, I mean, hopefully you would have covered all your expenses and a little bit of a margin, and then just go ahead and, deliver the project, even begrudgingly. Uh, but valuable learning out of that, so never do that. Like, always, see, the deal is when you price, if you price a little higher, you can always negotiate it down. But because that's what clients usually do, right? Okay, so imagine that I mean, let's say that, okay, you are going to do an e-commerce site, and you quote, let's say, $1,500, which is competitive, but for some clients, $1,500 could be a little higher. Then they will try to negotiate it down. But imagine that you started with, let's say, I don't know, $500. They are never going to negotiate it up. So you are at a massive disadvantage. So always, err on the safe side. So, quote a little higher and then negotiate it down. Yeah.
So Alka, shall we like sum up the whole thing? We'll wrap it up. I think we have reached our end as well. So is there any closing remarks that you would like to give the audience?
Okay. So in terms of final remarks, look, pricing is never going to be is never ending sort of a learning curve when it comes to pricing. You always learn something new every day. So don't ever think that, okay, that you have gotten your game right when it comes to pricing. That's one. Number two, um, if you can afford it, always work with a couple of people when it comes to pricing. Because what happens is when you have multiple people giving you input about what to do and how to go forward, um, if you are a good listener, it actually allows you to figure out what are the things that you have missed. So these are the things that I've learned over the years, and pricing to me is never ending. I mean, depending on the work that I do. So right now, if you ask me questions about pricing on, let's say, web development or mobile application development or projects, whatever, regarding software development, I will be able to answer that because I've done that enough times. But imagine if you ask me questions about pricing with, let's say, agricultural products, that's not going to be something that I'm familiar with. So one size never fits all. So this is very true for price when it comes to pricing. So learn as much as you can. So feel free to go through the presentation that I've shared, and then if you have any questions. All right. So yeah, I think Nitu, we are done.
So I think we can end the session from here. I think all of us can take something out from the session, like do value your time and do price in terms of that. And Aloka did talk in terms of different avenues on and different pricing strategies as well. So thank you once again, Aloka, for like taking your time and doing this session for us. I hope the audience actually got a lot of information out of this. So with that, I would like to conclude the Let's Talk session. So Let's Talk again is organized by the IEEE Young Professionals. So hope this session was actually very valuable in terms of content to everyone. And once again, thank you to all the participants for making this event a success. And also thank you, Aloka, once again for actually agreeing and talking to us on this topic. So I hope everyone would join us for future sessions as well. So thank you very much and see you soon. Stay tuned for more information. And good night and thanks again.